I'm Suzanne Teller, the Outreach Coordinator for the Luckiamute Watershed Council. We are an organization, a nonprofit organization that works with our watershed community, agencies, local government, schools, and community members to protect and restore the lands, rivers, and wildlife communities that make up our watershed. Today we are at Sarah Helmick State Park as part of our Love Your Watershed program. Love Your Watershed normally involves going out and enjoying the natural beauty of our watershed with events and bird walks and ID tours. However, during this time of COVID-19, we are going to love your watershed at home. Here we are standing on the south bank of the Luckiamute River. Above me is the bridge over the river, Highway 99. To the south is Corvallis. About 6 miles to the north is Monmouth. And what's interesting about Sarah Helmick State Park is that it is the very first state park established here in Oregon. It was donated back in 1922 as a small 5.5-acre parcel by Sarah Helmick and her husband. I'd like to introduce you to Jody Einerson and Brad Withrow-Robinson from the Oregon State University Extension Office. They're both with the Forestry and Natural Resources Department.
We're out in the park today to learn some skills to identify plants. And the first one I'm going to start with today is the vine maple. Got it all around me here, right here. But I have a branch here also that you can see. Maples are a native plant here in the Willamette Valley. We have 2 native maple species, and this one is the vine maple. And it's what they call palmately lobed. It kind of looks like a hand, so palmately. It has 5 to 7 of these lobes on it, and it also has the seeds that you may be familiar. They were like helicopter seeds that fly down out of the sky that you see. That comes off the maple trees, and in the vine maple they're directly across and look like a propeller. A vine maple, it gets its name by vining it. It has very viney leaves or branches that go out, and it's an understory tree, so it doesn't get very large. It's a very important habitat tree for insects. They feed a lot on the leaves, and fortunately those insects are food for our songbirds, which you can hear all around us here, and a very important tree for that reason. Here we have our other native maple tree, the big leaf maple. Of course, it's named because of the huge leaf that you can see here. It also is palmately lobed, like the vine maple that we just looked at. Much bigger though. You can see it has the big lobes that go in like this way. Again, it has opposite leaves. You can see it's coming off the stem opposite. This tree is not an understory tree. It gets very large. It also has the same type of seed that the other one has, the samaras that are like the winged helicopters. But these ones don't go straight across, they hang down. And they'll turn brown and start falling from the tree. The big leaf maple is one of the earliest trees to bloom of our native species, and it's a very important pollinator species. Our native bees are dependent on the flowers for both pollen and the nectar they give off. Here we have behind us the big leaf maple, a very big trunk tree, an older tree. As you can see, it has big arching branches that are covered with moss. They get lichen and licorice fern that grow on those. As they get older, they break off, and you can see behind me a hole there that makes a cavity, and those cavities are really important for nesting birds.
Here's another plant with a lobed leaf, a lot like the maples that Jody was talking about, but this one's interesting that because it has a lobed leaf doesn't mean that it's actually a maple. This leaf here has the same lobes, but they're arranged quite differently on the stem than the maples that Jody just talked about. And rather than being a tree, it's a small shrubby plant. This is actually Thimbleberry, and it is a member of the raspberry family. It has a beautiful white little flower here, and then inside you can see a berry forming, which will be a very dark red, soft fruit in a few weeks. And so this is a very soft leaf plant. It doesn't have thorns like its cousins, like most of its cousins, and it's just a nice plant to know. So here we have another really common tree in the Willamette Valley, part of our woodlands, and particularly our woodlands in wet and riparian areas. This is the Oregon ash. It's a fairly easy to identify tree. To use the same thing we've been talking about for maples, it also has opposite leaves and branches, but rather than a lobed leaf, this one has a compound leaf. Each individual leaf, and this is one leaf, has several different leaflets that are all stacked up together on one leaf and then are attached to the twig at a point. So Oregon ash is compound leaf, opposite array on the branch, and it has separate male and female plants. So this here we're seeing the seed pods left from last year, and like maple there's a hard seed here and then a little wing which will flutter down and allow the seed to be carried with the wind. And then this is hanging on from last year, and right about now or recently they have flowered, and some trees would probably have new seeds forming for this year. Ash, like maple, plays an important role in the habitat. It often has these long draping pieces of lichens, which is some biodiversity, and like the maple tree, it'll often lose a branch and have cavities for nesting birds and mammals. So Oregon, white ash, a common tree in riparian areas. When people think about riparian trees in western Oregon, this is one of the ones they think about. This is the red alder tree. We use some of the same rules to identify. We look to see if the plant is opposite or alternate, and this is alternate, where the leaves and the branches are staggered rather than opposite each other. The alder has a pointed leaf, and this rough edge in the red alder actually has two serrations. It has a big tooth and a little tooth. So that makes this double serration that goes along its edge here. And the leaves can actually, in fast-growing trees, can get fairly large, 6 or 8 inches long. It's a fast-growing tree. It comes in after disturbance, likes floods that stir up the ground, which is why we often find it along riparian areas. And it fixes nitrogen, or it has microbes growing on its roots that fix the nitrogen. So it can come into very sandy areas, perhaps, and pack its own lunch, produce its own nitrogen that allows it to grow very fast.
Here we have another really important shrub plant of the forest, and this is a snowberry. You find them all over in Oregon, not only in the west side, but even some of the east side areas. You can see that it has opposite leaves on it, very oval shaped. It has these distinctive small pink flowers. They kind of are reminiscent of a blueberry flower, kind of bell-shaped. Those will mature into very white, small berries that get on the plant. This is one plant that holds its berries all through the winter. It's not a preferred plant food for birds. When nothing else is available to them, they will eat it. So it could be an important food plant if they're having a really tough winter. The other thing about snowberry is it can come up with some very odd-shaped leaves. So here is one new stem that's coming out. And you can see, look at the size of the leaves on this thing. Oh, and also it's lobed. Here this tree is just starting to bloom. And you can see the flowers here on the end. There's just one that's starting to open. They'll have kind of pinkish colored flowers. And those will mature into very white berries that stay on the plant for a long time. They'll hold it all through the winter. Here I have two of the berry plants that we have in abundance in western Oregon. One is the trailing blackberry, which is a native. There's also an invasive blackberry, but this one is a native one. And the salmon berry. So the one on the top here is the trailing blackberry. As you can see, it kind of droops over, but it has a long stem that kind of vines, and it's very round. It does have thorns along it, but it's not nearly as thorny as the invasive blackberries that we have here. And you can see it has a group of 3 leaves together here. This other one I have is a salmon berry. It tends to grow in a more upright habit. A lot of times you'll see them standing straight up. It also has a roundish stem, but it doesn't have the thorns on it that the blackberry has. And also in its group of 3 leaves, which you can see somebody's been eating on this one, but if you take the front one away and just look at the back 2 leaves, it looks like a set of butterfly wings. So that's how I tell that one apart.
So here's an interesting plant, common plant in the Willamette Valley in some of our wet areas, and this is stinging nettle. So forgive me if I do not handle it. It's fairly characteristic and easy to recognize. It has these leaves with this serrated edge, a long tip. It is fuzzy, trust me, on the underside, and it's those little fuzzy pieces that will get into your skin, the little tiny spines, and they will feel like you've been slapped, and it can sting for an hour or more. It is opposite, as many herbaceous plants are. Here it's flowering, and it's wind pollinated, I believe, and so you can see these pretty flower stalks coming off. And things that I know about it is it's a common and popular springtime herb. Just as it's emerging out of the ground and is 4 to 6 inches, you put on a pair of gloves and nip them off and steam them up like spinach, and they're really quite tasty very early in the spring. So a good plant to get familiar with and try to avoid if you have a lot of exposed skin. So here's a nice patch of some of our native herb species that we commonly find in the Willamette Valley woodlands. Probably the most common and widespread would be this tall flowering one here called Fringe Cup. And if you look it up, or some pictures, you might be able to see that it's named for these little fringes that are around this small flower that's white or pink. And it has this rounded leaf, very common in our woodlands in the Willamette Valley. A couple other plants that are nice to see. Here we have water leaf. It's finished flowering or just finishing up, and it's setting seed now. And it has this lobed leaf, soft and fuzzy, a little lighter on the back than the front, but that's common in patches. You'll see a pretty dense patch of that in a nice shaded, moist area. And then the third plant that we stopped and saw here is this meadow rue. And it implies that it likes to be out in the open in meadows, and it does very well out there, but it's often in our wooded areas as well. This one has finished flowering, and I think it was a male. This is one of those plants that has both male and female flowers. It has this nice compound leaf with all these little leaflets. It has a very nice, soft, feathery effect to it. And so those are 3 of our common perennial woodland species that we see in the Willamette Valley.
Here we have another herbaceous plant, the cow parsnip. Very dramatic, large plant, white umbel type flowers. That means it kind of looks like an umbrella. Not a whole lot of leaves on the plant, a lot more towards the bottom. But again, it's the dramatic size. It's in the carrot family. And as you can see, if I turn it this way, how it's domed like an umbrella with all the flowers across the top. Here we have the Delphinium, nice bright blue that you don't often see a wildflower in the forest this color. It has a very long spike that comes up. This is the wild version of the Delphinium or the larkspur that people have in their gardens. And you can see that the leaves on this plant are very spiky and very pointed on the end.
All right, so here we have a very common tree in Western Oregon, not one that we always associate with a riparian area, though depending on the soils and situation they can be. This one, though you don't see the foliage, is our state tree, the Douglas Fir. It does have a characteristic bark with deep furrows. It's a thick bark, deeply furrowed, that run up and down, that helps many people get familiar and be able to recognize this plant even when the leaves are too high up to see them. I will say it's sometimes challenging to recognize some of these trees in the spring, because one of the ways we can identify them is by their buds that are around most of the year, but not at this time. So what I'm looking for right now that helps me recognize the Douglas Fir, I would look at the whole tree and look at the bark. has a very characteristic bark. And on the branches, we see how the needles, which are really leaves, are arranged on the stem. And here they kind of spread all the way around the stem. The other thing that we see as we're looking at this is we're seeing a couple years worth of needles. So we have the new year's growth, this current year's growth out here, which is still very soft and just emerging. And then we have needles from the previous years that are darker green. And when you flip the branch over, you can see it's a paler color. We have, if you look very closely, you'd see some little white lines on the underside of the leaf. The other way we look at that helps us identify Douglas firs, if you find the cones. They have a very characteristic cone. It's a couple inches long, but the thing that stands out are these little tiny pointy bracts, or these little things that stick out from underneath the scales of the cone. And we like to tell kids it looks like a little mouse's butt as it slips in under the cone. You got the long tail and then the little feet there. Okay, so here's another common conifer tree in the Willamette Valley. This one is the grand fir, and it's not as widespread as the Douglas fir is, but it likes moist areas, so it's not uncommon to see it as one of our riparian area trees. This also has a fairly characteristic bark. On an older tree like this, it's got this gray color. It has much shallower furrows than the Douglas fir does, and a little platy. It has little smaller pieces. When you get up higher in the tree than we can see here, the thin bark often has these blisters, these pitch blisters that make it very characteristic as a young tree or the young part of a tree. This is a true fir that we find on the valley floor, and it has longer needles than the Douglas fir. They are uneven length and they're blunt, and then most characteristically is they are more flatly arrayed than the Douglas fir. They don't come all the way around. They're kind of in ranks that come off to the side. So it has this much flatter display. And if we had buds, these would be very round bundles, very round balls, a cluster of them at the end, and the Douglas fir would be more like a pointy football. And then here we have very distinct white lines on the underside of the needles of the grand fir. All right, so here we have another tree, less common, but an interesting tree that we find sometimes in riparian areas, even this far out into the valley. This is the yew tree. It's a conifer with needles and has very thin bark, very distinctive, different bark than the Doug fir or the grand fir. It's thin and kind of has these long flakes on it. And because of the thin bark, it is not very fire adapted, so we wouldn't have seen it widespread in the valley floor because of that. And this is a much less common tree, not in a lot of places. We see it often in the shady understory, and it has short, dark needles, also flatly arrayed. They're not spread all around, and a lighter color, but not with that clear white that the other two trees have.
Identifying native plants can feel really daunting because there is so many of them. Even a trained botanist can't know all the names of all the plants out there, but what they do have in common and what you could have is to learn how to read a dichotomous key, which tells you how to divide things out, and getting a simple book like this one, Trees to Know in Oregon, is a good start. Once you get inside the book, that has all kinds of definitions, so if you're trying to figure out what shape or what kind of pattern you have, it helps you out there. And then you can go to a key. This one's a really simple one to use because it uses actual pictures that help you walk through, and you answer the questions yes or no, and helps you come to the species that you're looking at.
Yeah, I want to close by saying thank you to Brad and Jody for explaining some of the species that you can find in the Willamette forests. And I also want to say a big thank you to Willamette Habitat Restoration Fund, which provided the funds that allowed us to bring this video to you.